Wow. Okay. So you weren't kidding when you said you wanted a deep dive on this one.
No kidding?
A whole stack of articles.
Yeah.
And even an investigative report on the aftermath of that Canton murder trial, the Karen Reed case. But get this, you're not focused on the murder itself.
Right.
You want to know about the investigation into Detective Kevin Albert, one of the cops involved in a related case?
Yeah.
Buckle up, because this one takes some wild turns.
Yeah. It's like you handed us a puzzle with all these pieces, news clippings, official reports, text messages, and asked us to make sense of it all.
Ever get that feeling, like you're reading a news story and it's like, well, peeking through a keyhole, you get these like glimpses, these tantalizing glimpses of something bigger, right?
Yeah.
Something going on behind the scenes, but you can't quite see the whole picture.
It's like the tip of the iceberg, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We only see the sensational stuff, the headlines.
And today we're swapping that keyhole for, what's a good analogy? Like X-ray vision. We're going deeply. So for those who maybe haven't followed every twist and turn of the Karen Reed case, let's quickly recap Detective Kevin Albert. He's the officer we're focused on today. And this whole thing started because of testimony given during that trial, specifically testimony from a state trooper named Michael Proctor. See, Proctor and Albert were working together on a separate cold case. And, well, things got a little complicated.
And thankfully, with this investigative report you've provided, we get this rare glimpse behind the curtain of internal police investigations.
Yeah.
We can really trace the decision-making, see how those complications unfolded.
Unpacking a case really gets into, police procedures, internal investigations, the stuff most people never get to see.
And this one is a doozy. We're talking about Detective Kevin Albert, Canton Police Department. A cold case he was working back in July 2022.
This is one of those stories, anyone who, is fascinated by how law enforcement works, especially in their smaller towns, this is going to be right up your alley. Because we've got our usual stack of news articles, right? Mass Live, CBS Boston, the usual suspects. But then we got our hands on something else, something even better.
Oh, let's hear it.
A full-blown investigative report.
No way.
Obtained by CBS Boston, by the way. So witness interviews, timelines, the nitty-gritty you usually don't get to see.
That's gold. It's like, okay, think about it this way. You can watch a courtroom drama on TV.
Right.
Or you can actually be a fly on the wall during the investigation itself. That's what we've got here.
100%. So, okay, quick recap just in case, somebody missed this whole thing. Detective Albert, he's assigned to a cold case up in Sandwich, Massachusetts.
Sandwich, okay.
Already sounds kind of intriguing, right? But wait, it gets better.
Always does.
Because guess what? This case ends up being tied to, are you ready for this? The location where the victim in the Karen Reed case was found.
Whoa, you're kidding. The Boston police officer, John O'Keefe.
The one and only.
And wait, didn't they just have that trial?
Mistrial, actually.
Right, of course. But okay, hold on. So how does Albert fit into this? I don't remember his name coming up.
Okay, so this is where it gets really tangled. Detective Albert, he wasn't involved in the Karen Reed investigation.
Okay.
At least not directly.
Okay.
But, and this is the but with a capital B, his name got dragged into the case because of his brother, Brian Albert.
Oh, I'm starting to see it. Wasn't he somehow connected to that location? The one where they found O'Keefe?
Bingo. He was the homeowner.
Wow. Small world. Talk about a tangled web. So wait, if Albert wasn't on the case, how did his name even come up?
Text messages, my friend. Text messages.
Juicy.
During Reed's trial, right, they released these, pretty eye-opening exchanges between Detective Albert and the lead investigator on the Reed case, State Trooper Michael Proctor.
And I'm guessing these weren't your typical, hey, how's the weather texts?
Not even close. We're talking accusations of drinking on the job, misplacing his badge, even potentially his service weapon.
Whoa, okay, that's not good. That's how you go from small-town detective to front-page news real quick.
And that's exactly what happened. Those accusations, come on, red flags galore, right?
Yeah, talk about an HR nightmare.
So they launch a full-blown internal investigation, which means the police department is investigating one of their own.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Because we get to see, thanks to that investigative report, exactly how these things go down.
Not just the accusations, but the process itself, right? Separating fact from fiction.
100%. Okay, so we've got these, seriously intense accusations flying around, right? And it all comes back to these text messages. But I gotta know, what did they actually find out? Did those texts tell the whole story? Or was it just, a few things taken out of context?
Well, that's the thing about this investigation, right? It wasn't just about what was said in those texts. It gets way more interesting. They brought in this attorney, Terrence Delahanty, to lead the whole thing. And this guy, he was thorough. Like, seriously, treated it like a detective would a major case.
So we're talking like witness interviews, the whole 9 yards.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so picture this. It's July 2022. Albert and Proctor are on this cold case. The report keeps the details vague for obvious reasons, and they decide to head to Sandwich to interview someone. Seems routine enough, right?
Standard police work on the surface. But this is where those seemingly insignificant details start to add up.
Because we see this text from Albert to Proctor that says, and I'm quoting here, soak up the overtime. Now, you don't have to be a seasoned detective to wonder what's going on there.
Right. That kind of message could be open to interpretation, but within the context of police culture, where overtime pay is often a point of contention, it raises questions.
Yeah.
Was it a harmless joke between colleagues, or was there a sense that they were intentionally stretching out their day, maybe even taking advantage of the system? But it goes even further. I mean, they were digging into everything. Credit card statements, Google Maps data. I mean, they even used it to retrace Albert's steps that night, see if his timeline actually lined up. They were really trying to build a case, piece by piece.
Okay, but for a few text messages, seems a little, I don't know, extreme. What were they even hoping to find?
Well, they had to know for sure, right? I mean, did he break the rules? Did he break the law? They had to look into the accusations, like that whole thing about soaking up the overtime. They actually went back and looked into how Can PD handles their overtime, see if there was any truth to it.
Wow. Okay, so they're like investigating the investigation.
Pretty much.
And here's where the story takes that turn we talked about on their way back from Sandwich. They don't just head straight back to the station. First, they stop at Treehouse Brewing Company, not just for a quick one either. They have drinks there and grab some beers to go. Then they decide to have dinner at Flanders Field in Hanover.
So we're not talking about a quick coffee break here. This is turning into quite the evening. So did Albert actually drink on the job? What about the badge? The gun? They needed answers.
All right, you got me on the edge of my seat. What'd they find? Lay it on me.
And naturally, as we'll see, those later accusations about alcohol use really make this timeline significant. It paints a picture of an evening that seems to go well beyond a standard work trip.
You know what they say, where there's smoke, there's fire, and in this case where there's a brewery and a restaurant, well, there are more text messages, and they seem to suggest Detective Albert might have enjoyed himself a little too much.
And that's what makes this investigation so compelling. It's all about piecing together the timeline, the evidence, and those differing perspectives to see if they line up. Did Detective Albert's actions cross the line from a night out to a violation of the department's trust?
Because the next morning is when things really hit the fan, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Remember Trooper Proctor? The next morning, he sends a text to Albert that throws everything into question. It simply says, "Found your badge in my cruiser."
Okay, now losing your badge, that's not a good look for any cop, right?
No.
But the report doesn't just gloss over it. It specifically points to Rule 12.12, which outlines the strict protocols for officers. They're responsible for their badges at all times and have to report a lost badge immediately.
And the thing about law enforcement, these rules aren't just suggestions. They're designed to maintain order, accountability, and public trust. A missing badge could potentially be used to impersonate an officer, access sensitive areas, all sorts of things. So this seemingly small detail suddenly becomes a big deal.
So where does Albert stand on this? Does he fess up?
Well, he claims he took his badge off in the car for comfort and didn't even realize he'd left it behind. He says he didn't consider it lost, just misplaced. And get this, Lieutenant Galliver Albert's direct supervisor backs him up, saying removing your badge in the car is pretty common practice and not a big deal.
Wait, really? The supervisor doesn't see this as a problem.
It's a perfect illustration of the complexities we often encounter in these deep dives.
Yeah.
What seems like a clear-cut rule on paper might have a different interpretation within the actual culture of the department. It begs the question, is this a case of turning a blind eye to minor infraction? Or is there a deeper disconnect between the rules and how they're actually enforced? Okay, so first things first, the investigation, they confirm that, yeah, Albert did drink while he was on duty 2 beers at dinner with Trooper Proctor, Flanders Field, Hanover.
Okay, so that part of the text was true, but wasn't that, like, allowed? I mean, he was at dinner.
Here's the thing, and this is where it gets, well, kind of crazy. Having those 2 beers, even at dinner, even during a meal break, it's against Canton PD policy. Straight up, no exception.
Whoa, I had no idea it was that strict. Okay, but what about the badge and his gun? Did they find anything on that?
Okay, so this is where all that, meticulous stuff, it really comes in handy.
Uh-huh.
Credit card statements, those Google Maps timelines, the witness interviews, they used all of it to piece together exactly what happened.
Okay, I'm waiting.
Turns out, Albert, he did leave his badge in Proctor's cruiser, left it behind, but he got it back the next day.
And as if the badge situation wasn't enough, things escalate from there. Remember those text messages? Well, shortly after that, found your badge. Text, Albert sends another one to Proctor that's downright concerning. He asks, did I take my gun? And it gets worse. He adds a wincing face emoji at the end. I mean, talk about an uh-oh moment.
It's like that moment in a movie when you know things are about to go very wrong.
Mm-hmm.
We've moved from a misplaced badge to a potentially missing firearm. Now Rule 12.14 comes into play, which, as you can imagine, is even stricter than the badge rule.
Because if you're not careful with your badge, that's bad.
What?
But if you're careless with your service weapon, well, that could have devastating consequences.
Exactly. And the implications go beyond just recklessness. The report highlights the legal ramifications of a police officer mishandling a firearm, potentially, where under the influence of alcohol. It's a serious accusation.
So what's Albert's explanation for this one? Surely he can't brush this off as easily as the badge?
His defense is that he was joking. He claims he clearly remembered securing his firearm in Proctor's cruiser, and that the text was meant to be humorous, albeit in poor taste. And here's where it gets really interesting. Proctor's official statement actually corroborates Albert's side of the story. He backs up the claim that the gun was never actually missing.
So we're left with two completely different interpretations of this text message. On one hand, it could be evidence of extreme negligence, potentially fueled by alcohol. On the other hand, it could be a bad joke, a dark attempt at humor that backfired spectacularly. So what's the truth?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to answer that, we have to look beyond the individual actions and consider the context, the credibility of those involved, and ultimately the findings of the official investigation.
Because amidst all this back and forth, all these allegations and defenses, the Canton Police Department knew they had a potential powder keg on their hands. And that's where the internal investigation comes in, right? To try and cut through all the noise and figure out what really happened that night.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Enter attorney Terrence M. Delahanty. He's brought in to conduct a completely independent investigation, answering directly to the chief of police. His job is to look at all the evidence, the texts, the timelines, the testimonies, and determine if Detective Albert violated any department policies.
And his report doesn't disappoint. It's thorough, meticulously organized, and tackles all the big questions head on. But for our deep dive today, we're going to focus on the parts that are most relevant to you, our listener.
We'll unpack the key issues. Did Albert's actions constitute criminal conduct? Was there any falsification of work hours? And did his behavior fall into the category of conduct unbecoming of an officer?
Let's start with the most serious question first. Did Albert break the law by possessing a firearm while potentially under the influence of alcohol?
This is where Delahanty's report gets fascinating.
Yeah.
He doesn't just jump to conclusions. He meticulously analyzes the timeline of that evening, factors in the amount of alcohol Albert reportedly consumed, considers the driving time between locations, and even examines that hungover text message we mentioned earlier.
So what's the verdict?
Delahanty concludes that based on the available evidence, there isn't enough to definitively prove Albert was intoxicated to the point of being unable to handle his firearm safely. Remember, we're talking about a very specific legal standard here, and Delahanty seems to be approaching it with an appropriate degree of caution.
So that's one serious allegation down, but we're not out of the woods yet. What about the potential for a fraudulent claim of work hours? After all, there was that soak up the overtime text. Did Albert essentially pad his timesheet?
Delahanty tackles that question head-on as well. He scrutinizes the timeline, cross-references Albert's account with data from Google Maps, and even dives into the department's overtime practices.
What's the verdict on this one?
Delahanty finds that Albert's overtime claim actually aligns with the plausible timeline and the department's standard procedures for overtime compensation. So while the soak up the overtime text might raise eyebrows, Delahanty doesn't find sufficient evidence to call it a deliberate attempt to defraud the department.
2 down, 1 to go. We've addressed the potentially criminal allegations, and Delahanty seems to have given Albert the benefit of the doubt on those. But even if his actions weren't technically illegal, there's still the issue of whether they violated department policy.
And this is where Delahanty draws a line in the sand. When it comes to the possession or consumption of alcohol, while on duty, the report is crystal clear. Albert violated department policy. The evidence, including his own admission of having drinks at Treehouse Brewing Company and then going for dinner at Flanders Field, is pretty much irrefutable.
Which leads us to the final and perhaps most damning finding: conduct unbecoming of an officer.
This is where the report goes beyond the letter of the law and addresses the spirit of it. Delahanty concludes that even if Albert didn't technically break the law in those two specific instances, his actions that night, especially drinking while on duty, reflected poorly on him, his fellow officers, and the entire Canton Police Department. It's a stark reminder that police officers are held to a higher standard both on and off duty, and that public trust is paramount.
So after this in-depth investigation, these detailed findings, what are the consequences for Detective Albert? What's the fallout from this whole ordeal? I bet you're thinking, okay, they went through all that. There has to be some serious fallout for this detective. It does feel like there should be consequences for these kinds of actions, right?
You'd think so, and it's certainly what many people expected when this whole thing came to light.
Yeah.
But the report states that Albert received a relatively light punishment, a 3-day suspension without pay. And here's the kicker. According to the latest news articles you sent, he's already back on the job.
3 days. That's it. For everything we just discussed. It does make you wonder about the severity of those consequences, especially considering the potential damage to the department's reputation.
It's interesting, right? Because the report itself doesn't really delve into the reasoning behind that specific disciplinary action. What it does do is shift gears to focus on Delahanty's recommendations for the future. It's like he's saying, okay, here's how we can prevent it from happening again.
And those recommendations are pretty telling. For one, Delahanty suggests a significant change to how the department handles overtime, particularly for specialized roles like detectives. He proposes that this overtime should be logged by a supervisor, not the officers themselves.
It does seem like a direct response to that soak up the overtime text. By implementing this recommendation, the department could eliminate any ambiguity surrounding overtime hours and create a more transparent system. It's about removing that potential for abuse and reinforcing accountability.
The other big recommendation is a department-wide review of all those rules and regulations we've been talking about. But Delahanty doesn't stop there. He emphasizes the need for in-person training sessions to make sure every officer fully understands those policies, followed by documented acknowledgement from each officer. It's not enough to have rules in a handbook somewhere. They need to be front and center.
Absolutely. This recommendation speaks to the importance of clear communication and consistent enforcement. It's about creating a culture where everyone is on the same page, where the expectations are clear, and the consequences for stepping out of line are understood by all.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've untangled the incident itself, explored the investigation, dug into the findings, and even looked at potential steps for the future. But there's one last thing I can't shake, and it might be the most intriguing piece of this whole puzzle. This entire deep dive, this whole chain of events, it all started because of the Karen Reed murder trial.
It all circles back, doesn't it? It was Trooper Proctor's testimony in that trial, his decision to reveal those text messages that sparked this entire investigation into Detective Albert.
And there's one detail from the initial murder case that the report on Albert doesn't explicitly address, but I think it's important for us to consider as we wrap things up. Remember how we learned that Albert's brother, Brian Albert, was the homeowner where the murder victim was found?
Ah, yes. That connection adds another layer of complexity to all of this.
Right. It's not just a random detail. It creates this unavoidable question of potential conflict of interest. Did that family tie that connection to the initial murder case have any influence on how this investigation into Kevin Albert was conducted? Was there any pressure, even subconsciously, to protect someone perceived as being connected to a tragedy? We don't have a definitive answer for you, but it's definitely something to consider as we reflect on everything we've learned.
It highlights how even the most thorough investigations, the most detailed reports, can still leave us with lingering questions. It's a reminder that there are often complexities and nuances that exist beyond the black and white of official findings.
And that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating, isn't it? We've gone beyond the headlines, pieced together the evidence, and hopefully given you, our listener, a more nuanced understanding of this intricate situation. But more importantly, we've given you some things to ponder, maybe even sparked a little healthy skepticism.
Because sometimes the most important takeaways aren't the answers we uncover, but the questions we're left asking.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this. What do you make of it all? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep those curious minds working and keep those sources coming.